Good evening. It's Mr. Evans. We are still in our book Dollar for Luck by Elizabeth Coatsworth, and tonight we are beginning with chapter 8. The night set in as foggy as the day, without a ray of moon or star to lighten it. But by that time Ken was snug in the crumbling house. The lamb wished to follow him about, but it got in his way, and after a little he shut it into the roofless ell, and, in the deepening gray of a foggy twilight, hurried down the lane toward the cove. In the small visible circle in which he moved, he kept a sharp lookout for such landmarks as he could see, and did not let himself think about the question of the killing of the sheep, knowing that he would need all his attention to guide him, with the fog still pressing in everywhere. When he came to the first landmark, two stones set on one another on top of the wall to show where to cross into the pasture, he could hardly believe that he was already there. The path had seemed so much shorter on the second trip. In spite of the fog, he scarcely had to hesitate for clues. As though walking in a cloud, he crossed the open land, found the marked spruces and the path, and came out on the cove and the small lapping of ripples. Something, whether bird or animal, had dragged one fish further along the roof and eaten half of it, but the others were untouched. Ken took a last look at the pea pod, firmly tied as he had left it, and pulled up under the bank, and with his fish in the bait basket, retraced his steps without difficulty, although it was almost dark by the time he reached the doorstep and the broken front of his shelter. The lamb made a great baaing at his approach, and he opened the paneled door and let it join him, while he remade the fire and cooked himself another fish and heated a can of peas. He had no hesitation in using what he found on the old shelf, knowing that when in need, a stranger is welcome to whatever may be in a camp. When the storeboat found him, he could replace anything he had used, and more too. But he would have to husband his resources. There were not many cans: coffee, condensed milk, a large can of baked beans, a can of tomatoes, and the peas which he had opened. But tomorrow, if the fog held and there was still no chance of rescue, he would gather blueberries and mushrooms and blackberries. When Ken had eaten, he washed his dish and fork and spoon, and left them to dry by the fire. There was a lantern with oil in it hanging on a nail. He lighted it and went over to the bunk made of birch posts and a few boards. The man who had made it was no carpenter, but it would do. Ken tossed up all the hay in the bed and found, as he expected, a mouse's nest, which he put, young mice and all, in a wisp of hay in the corner of the room. Now his preparations were all made. There was more hay in the ell, and he made a bed for the lamb and shut it up for the night. Then he turned the lantern down to a mere spark of light and hung it back on the nail, and got into the hay, leaving on all his clothes but taking off his shoes. From his bed he looked out across the old room to the fire burning low in the great worn fireplace. The dull red of the room glowed softly in the firelight. There was still glass in place in the small panes of the windows to the north on either side of a door, but to the south there was nothing but the night, with its white sheet of vapor which flowed even into the room. The house was like a big lean-to, Ken thought, or like a room on a stage. He had only been once to the theater, when they gave Uncle Tom's Cabin at Rockland, and the whole family had hired a gig and driven over. They hadn't got back until 2 o'clock in the morning. It was quite an expedition, but worth it 10 times over. The side of the house lay all in pieces on the ground where it had fallen. Ken figured it must have blown down in the big gale 2 years ago, which he remembered because old Mr. Young had lost the roof off a hen coop. Even half fallen down as it was, Ken liked the place. He wondered who the first people were who lived in it and built all those fine stone walls. A few hours ago he'd been drifting to sea in the Peapod, and here he was on land, with a roof over his head, and a dinner inside him, and a warm bed to sleep in. Never mind the musty smell. A smell wouldn't hurt anyone. Of course, everything wasn't hunky-dory on the island. Down the pasture were all those sheep carcasses. That was an ugly business. But whoever had killed them had taken what they wanted and gone. There'd be no reason for them to stay around after they'd done a thing like that, and good reason for them to get out quick. Ken tried not to think about it, and tired as he was, he soon went to sleep. He was awakened sometime in the night by hearing a man's voice at a little distance. It took him a moment to remember where he was. The fire was down to ashes and embers. The musty hay tickled his face. Then he remembered and lay very still, listening. He heard curses, and then, "Where the devil is that lamb?" Another voice, not so deep, said, "Told you we ought to take it along." The first voice cursed again. "And have its blats giving us away? Here it was on the hoof until we'd sold the rest and could come back for ourselves. Well, 'tain't here now. Foxes may have took it. Too big. It's strayed somewhere. We'll find it." While the men talked, Ken had slipped out of bed and put on his shoes. Looking out of the window, he could see a faint light in the fog, which he knew must be a lantern, not far off down the pasture, moving about as the men searched among the bushes. They were slowly working up toward the house. What should he do? Dad always says to carry the war into the enemy's country, Ken thought. These men have been up to mischief, and they'll be scary. Working fast, he threw an armful of hay onto the embers, so that the fire suddenly blazed, and, catching the lantern from the nail, turned up the wick as far as possible, and ran out of the north door, slamming it behind him. He made directly towards the other lantern, holding his own high and running as noisily as possible. He would have shouted, but he knew his boy's voice would give him away. The sheep killers must think that a man was running toward them. For what seemed like an interminable length of time, the fog-haloed lantern down the pasture remained immobile. It took all Ken's courage to keep him running towards it, but suddenly, with an exclamation and, "Let's get out of here," the light jerked, and the man who held it began to run, with the other behind him. Of the actual men, Ken could see nothing but vague shadows in the fog. It was the misty light of the lantern which his lantern followed like vengeance. Once the foremost fugitive stumbled and nearly dashed out his light, and Ken slowed down until the flight was renewed. He had no wish to overtake the fugitives, but only to keep them on the run. They must think that he was the angry owner of the sheep, unexpectedly returned to the island. So long as they thought that, they would keep on running. They had come to trees now, here a thin line only. Ken went slowly through them to give the men more time. When he came into the open, the other lantern had been blown out. Though he could see nothing at all, he could hear water and the sound of a dory being rasped hastily down a stony beach, then the thud of boots on planking and the rattle of oars in oarlocks, and, last, the sound of someone hastily rowing away. Maine must be over there, Ken thought. This is the other side of the island from where I landed. He turned his lantern low, and holding it between himself and the men, started back, still careful to carry it at man's height. But it would take a good deal to make the sheep killers suspect that what had chased them off the island was only a 13-year-old boy. Ken was pretty sure they'd not try to come back again for the sake of any lamb which they hadn't been able to find anyway. Not now that they'd think the owner was on hand. The trip back to the house was easy enough. Ken kept working his way slowly uphill through the pasture, and after a while he could see a dim fog-shrouded light from the windows of the old house. The flare of hay had burned out almost immediately, but there was still a last glow from the fire. He probably had been gone only 8 or 9 minutes, though it had seemed a good deal longer than that. The lamb began to bleat as it heard Ken come in. All right, he told it. Hold your horses, I'm back. And we've got to go to sleep. It's the middle of the night still. Maybe by morning the wind will change and blow this fog out to sea again. Chapter 9. Ken had gone to sleep, hoping that when he woke up he might look out on sunshine and a bright blue sea below his headland. But when he opened his eyes, it was to see the familiar fog, stretched like a curtain across the front of the room where he lay. Yet it was a moving curtain, and thinner than it had been the day before. Wisps wandered about inside the house like faint, inquisitive spirits, tiptoeing silently here and there, and melting away before the stare of the boy in the corner of the room. Hearing him move, the lamb began calling from the L, and Ken rose, a little stiffly, to let it out. There was hay in his hair, and he felt tired and listless after the hard rowing and the anxiety of the day before. He stood where the door had been and looked around him. The fog was certainly frazzling out. Now and then a spruce appeared in a rent of the veil, or a piece of the stone wall, or even an eye of blue sky, only to disappear again. But he could still see nothing of the shore. After he had fried some baked beans in a pan and made some coffee, Ken felt better. He found a large bare shelf of rock and began gathering on it a heap of dead wood. Fortunately, there was an axe in the house, and with it he lopped off the dead lower branches of the spruces and dragged them across the pasture until he had a high heap of them. Then he made a heap of green branches, for when the time came for lighting a fire, he would want a good deal of smoke which would show up against the sky. It was hard work, but Ken began to enjoy it. He imagined how Cliff and Belle would feel when they saw the signal, and guessed that he was safe on shore. After he had finished the brush pile, he cut down a young spruce and lopped off all its branches until only a pole was left. Then he hunted about the house, going up the dangerous stairs to the upper story, and looking about the two little chambers there under the roof. But nowhere could he find a piece of white cloth, and ruefully at last he sacrificed his shirt, tying it to one end of the pole. It was not easy to climb into another tree, carrying the pole with him, but at last Ken succeeded, while the lamb stood below, watching his every move from its agate eyes. It had adopted him as its next of kin, and hated to have him out of sight for a moment. When Ken had finished lashing the pole to the top of the spruce with a piece cut from the well rope, and climbed down out of the tree, the lamb greeted him with great delight. The boy was touched by its devotion, and played with it for a while, scratching its woolly head and pretending to push at it as another lamb might push. The creature was puzzled but pleased by the attention, and when Ken went back into the house to build up the fire, to cook the last of his fish and some more baked beans, the lamb followed him more closely than ever. When the dishes were washed, Ken came out to the headland again. Now there was no doubt that the fog was trailing back to the sea from which it had come. He could make out whole stretches of the shoreline below him, and the blue water radiant through the haze. Blue sky shone everywhere with the hurry of fog across it. There was scarcely a sound, but he had a sense of almost furtive movement on all sides. Once more the fog was in full retreat. As suddenly as it had come, it was gone, drifting seaward and then melting entirely away. The sea lay below Ken's eyes, a vast sparkle of little crisscross waves, a plain of deepest blue. Several vessels appeared in sight, 2 or 3 of them schooners, and one tacking up the river he was sure must be the Pluribus. He was so excited that he scarcely glanced on his left, where, not very far away, lay the shores of Deer Isle, and the dark stubble of spruce woods outlining the green squares and oblongs of fields, with here and there a white pattern of little houses and barns. Later he'd find on the chart where his island lay. Now all his attention was fixed on the storeboat. How soon would Cliff and Belle see his signals? He'd soon know. Ken looked up to his shirt, flying high over the spruce tree. Then he hurried into the house for dry hay and matches, with the lamb trotting off after him. Carefully he arranged his materials and lighted the dry wood, and, as soon as the flames were crackling, began to lay on the green branches until the smoke rose in a heavy twisting column, almost like a pillar. The vessel he had taken for the pluribus changed her course and made for the island. "They've seen us," Ken shouted to the bewildered lamb. "It's Cliff and Belle." He hurried into the house and made sure that all was in order. The dinner fire was out, but he scattered the ashes and poured water on them. Then he lifted the mouse's nest back into the hay where he had found it, and closed the door into the L. There was nothing more to do in the house. Outside, his first glance went to the approaching schooner. It was still holding to its course in a light breeze. He climbed the spruce tree, lowered the pole, and regained his shirt. Then he scattered the remaining unused wood well below the outcrop of rock and began beating out the fire, bringing pail after pail of water from the well to throw on it. For a long time it seemed to fight back at him, spitting sparks and sending up great clouds of scalding steam and smoke at every onslaught of the water. But in the end he mastered it, until he could trample out the last wet embers with his shoes. Even then Ken made very sure, looking everywhere for any smallest plume of smoke, either from the bed of the fire or from the ground beyond the rock. But in the end he was satisfied that the fire was out and would stay out. Then at last, with another quick look to make sure that the schooner was still on her course, he hurried back to the well and coiled the mended rope under the upended bucket. Come along, lamb. It's time to be going," he called. But it was unnecessary to urge the lamb, which had been following him back and forth from well to fire and from fire to well, uncomprehending, of course, but determined not to be left alone for a minute if it could help it. Now it trotted at Ken's heels down the lane between the stone walls, which came as high as the boy's shoulder. At the trail marker, Ken lifted the lamb over the wall. Under its coat of wool, it was much lighter than it looked. Together they ran down the pasture and through the spruces. The water beyond was a dazzle of light, and like a vessel sailing through diamonds, the old pluribus appeared, headed for the island. Ken untied the pea pod, shoved it down to the water, and lifted in the lamb, which rolled its eyes for a little, but stood still as Ken got in, pushed off, and settled to the oars. He heard a joyous toot from Belle on the schooner, showing that he had been seen, and glancing over his shoulder, noticed that Cliff had changed course a little so as to meet him. Ken's shoulders felt stiff from yesterday's long ordeal at the oars, but it seemed wonderful to him to be on the water again, in the clear, bright, sea-smelling air, the planking of a boat under his feet, and the lisp and lapping of waves all about him. As the schooner came within shouting distance, Belle's voice hailed him. She seemed in no mood to scold. Pretty soon she began inquiring about the lamb, and it was she who leaned down over the rail to take it up when the peapod got within reach. The lamb fortunately held still, while Ken, balanced with his feet wide apart on the thwart, handed it up to her. Cliff, having brought the pluribus into the wind, came up grinning to give Ken a hand over the rail. "See you brought dinner along," he remarked, clapping the boy on the shoulder. "Found folks on the island, did you? Didn't know as anyone was living on Star now." Ken told them the whole story, while Cliff smoked his pipe and Belle knitted a sock, dropping half the stitches. "I'll have to rip it all out later," she said, "but I'm so excited I've got to be doing something. There was times yesterday I wondered if we'd ever lay eyes on you again in this life. That signal smoke was about the most beautiful sight I ever saw." As for the sheep butchering, both the Trasks were indignant. "Dirty tricks," said Cliff. "There's always scum wherever you go. They'll know at Stonington who the flock belonged to, and will notify 'em and replace the stuff you used." Even Marigold was glad to see Ken back, and very curious about the lamb, although she skittered away when the larger animal reached down an inquiring nose toward her. Ken was going to make a halter, but Belle said, "Let it run loose. We'll be in at Stonington before night." The Peapod was taken in again in tow, and the storeboat, sailing before the wind, moved sedately along the coast towards its next port of call, while Belle and Ken began decking out the shrouds with as much of the stock in trade as they could carry. They came into Stonington in full regalia to find a crowd, mostly of women and children, already at the wharf to meet them. After the first rush of visiting and shopping had begun to lull a little, Cliff said to an acquaintance, "I wonder if you could tell me who owns Star Island now." "Man named Joel Green, runs the grocery up the street." "He keeps sheep on the island?" "Yes, I believe he does. A small flock nowadays. Hasn't lived there for better than 20 years. Guess I'll go see him. Want to come along, Ken? You be all right, Belle, while we're gone?" "Don't hurry back. I can manage fine by myself," Belle said. In honor of being in port, she had put on a dress over her trousers and boots, and a straw hat with a ribbon, and was now deep in gossip and salesmanship. Cliff and Ken walked up the street past the stone quarries and came to the store, where they found a middle-aged man with a pleasant, spectacled face standing behind the counter. "Anything I can do for you?" he asked. And Cliff said, "Mr. Green?" "Yes, Joel Green's my name." "I'm Cliff Trask off the store boat, and this is Ken Philbrook. His father builds sloops over Friendship Way. Ken, you tell Mr. Green about what happened to you last night. First, I'd better say Ken got separated from the pluribus in the Peapod during the fog yesterday. My wife and I was real anxious, but he made out to land on Star and spent the night in an old house he found there. Now, Ken, you tell the rest." So Ken told the story of the butchered sheep and of the two men he had heard in the night, while Joel Green listened carefully, asking a question now and then. At the end, he said, "I guess that finishes my sheep raising. I've let the flock grow small. Didn't seem to have time for them, and I shan't buy any more. This takes it out of my hands." "Who do you think could do a thing like that?" Cliff asked. "No one from around here, but a lot of strangers drift along the coast, especially in summer. I've heard of a man selling mutton to the quarry camps, but didn't pay any heed. Now, like as not, he's skipped. I shan't try to do anything. Just be a waste of time, like hunting a flea on a St. Bernard dog. We want to pay for those cans the boy used." Joel Green's gray eyes smiled behind his glasses. "Not if I know it. I shan't be going back now. Those few things aren't worth bothering about. We'll bring the lamb." "Let the boy have the lamb. I don't want it." "But there's a lot of meat on a lamb." "I can get all the meat I want without any trouble. You've behaved very neighborly, letting me know how things stood on the island. I'd like the boy to have the lamb. He's the one who rescued it. Let him have it then. It's nothing to me." Ken was very pleased. It had never occurred to him that the lamb could be his. He'd like to take it back to Emily. A girl would like a pet lamb. But then he heard Cliff say, "I'm sure that's more than kind, Mr. Green. Fresh meat's always welcome on board. We get tired of fish and clams sometimes." That is the end of our reading for tonight. I will see you again tomorrow night, and we will start with Chapter 10. Have a good evening.